Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel on space, military, and security. I'm Professor Bert Chapman from Purdue University Libraries, where I'm the Government Information History and Political Science Librarian. And we have three different presenters today. I want to introduce you to them. First of all, up is Dr. Mark Peters. He currently works in DoD's unified platform, creating next generation cyber tools. He has published in a number of different security studies oriented journals and outlets, and he also has a numerous listing of military accomplishments included in the conference presentation. As I mentioned, I'm a professor of library science at Purdue University. My research interests include the literature of national security and international security and enhancing public awareness of and access to those resources. And then our concluding speaker today is Ivàn Gulmesoff. He's currently a global doctoral security student at American Military University. He also has served in a variety of international and domestic deployments within the U.S. Navy. His research include areas as global security, unmanned aerial vehicle technology, and space weaponization. So we'll begin with Mark.
Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing this morning? Normally you'd get an answer, you'd get some kind of speech or reaction, but as we're doing full virtual, we'll just skip that part. I'll just keep talking and hopefully that it goes smoothly for everybody. So at this point, you should be seeing my screen and it should be up there for everybody. And we'll start the timer so that I don't talk too long along the way. But what I was looking at as I was going forward is we talk about critical infrastructure. We talk about how we protect critical infrastructure. Looking at national security, critical infrastructure becomes one of those core functions. But we don't have space evaluated as core critical infrastructure, even as we expand into space and we do more of the space. So I started looking at that and started working on, as always, a paper and a research topic to look at how we could move forward. So what we're going to talk about is a little bit of the history of critical infrastructure, comparing some of the sectors, talking about the hypotheses I used along the way, qualitative analysis, kind of looking at a yes or no rather than using a big staff and going into the core economic functions. What might be space infrastructure in the way ahead? Dr. Chapman, thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it, just as I appreciate the time to speak here today for CISA. He pretty much summed it up. A lot of time in the military, working now in cybersecurity. Spent my time doing intelligence things for the military in various places in various countries all around the world. I got a chance to do space along the way, including commanding a space intelligence squadron as one of my final assignments. So when we talk about space CI, usually when we talk about critical infrastructure nowadays, we want to default to cyber. Everybody says it's covered by cyber and that cyber should be generic. Well, as a cybersecurity analyst, I can tell you it's not generic. And it's not generic to everybody. Different missions have different needs. Different infrastructure has different needs. And this was originally established when we tried to put in the DHS roles. We tried to split out everything. And you remember as we split out critical infrastructure, back in, we'll talk a little bit about the history, but back when President Clinton originally did it in the 1990s, and then when DHS was established after 9/11, what we saw was that these sections were just split out and they said, hey, you're going to have a commercial liaison and then you're going to have a government liaison. Then we're going to stand up an intelligence sensing and analysis center, an ISAC that's going to get you all the answers. And then everything will take care of itself. We don't have to worry after that. Well, that's not really the case. As we've seen in a lot of the presentations, now we're moving into the establishment of a space force that's kind of consolidating that military application. It makes sense as we get more and more production in space from places like SpaceX. We saw the potential collision of two satellites the other night. There's more and more commercial involvement as well. And space becomes a center where the U.S. really has to consider what goes on. So with that, I talked about using three hypotheses as a qualitative measurement to move forward. And those will come up in a little more detail later on. But the essentials is I used one that looked at public health, economy, and welfare, one that looked at national security, and then a counter and said, does anything else, does any other CI sector cover space well enough as a whole that I wouldn't have to have a different space sector? So like I mentioned briefly, we first saw critical infrastructure in 1996 under the Clinton administration. And President Clinton went out and he said, hey, we need a commission. These are the 8 areas I want you to go and look at as critical infrastructure. So go out and tell me what you find and tell me how these should be evaluated. And they were kind of the typical finance, banking, transportation, power generation, and those type of things. So unsurprisingly, the commission went out to look at the 8 things he told them to look at. They came back and said, hey, you know what? Those 8 things are right what we should look at. Those are critical infrastructure areas. We think we should protect those. And not only that, but for each of those 5 sectors or 5 areas, we think there should be 5 sectors. We think we should talk about information, energy, banking and finance, the physical distribution, the human services that are associated. And if we want to protect them, we're going to have to protect those 5 areas in line with those 8 sections. Well, that was well and good, and it became another government study. Nothing much happened after that until the 2001 Patriot Act. Because 2001 comes out and establishes the Department of Homeland Security and makes them the CI change agent. It officially designates them that they're responsible for protecting critical infrastructure, and they're responsible for modifying and changing anything that goes forward from that point. It reduced the sectors to 5 originally, HSPD 7, which is the Homeland Security Presidential Directive number 7, and then moves out. But it also set a government lead and then a liaison to a service for each one. So each sector that was out there as a critical infrastructure sector had a government person that was responsible and a liaison who was supposed to go back and talk to that sector. And next slide. So when we did it, I used the working definition out of the Patriot Act because you always have to have a good working definition as you evaluate hypothesis. So this was the one that was in there. This critical infrastructure definition is system and assets, whether physical or virtual, so vital to the United States that incapacity and destruction of such systems and assets would have a debilitating impact on security, national economic security, national public health or safety, or any combination of those matters. And that's where you'll see I got the hypothesis by splitting out economy, health, and safety together, then doing national security on the other side. And again, I used a qualitative, so I used a yes or no based on my evaluation. Obviously, with a longer term or more study, you'd send out surveys, you'd talk to a longer group of people. Maybe you'd look at the economic benefits, you'd compare different sectors for how much they contribute economically. But for this one, we'll be working qualitative. So those first 2 changes, the establishment of the DHS and President Clinton's initial directive, brings us to a more modern changes, right? Things that happened within the past 10 years. As far as those changes, in 2013, we see Presidential Policy Directive 21 under President Obama, which clarifies a lot of those functional relationships, sets them up in a more structured manner, and declares that each one has to have an information exchange, that there has to be somewhere through that ISAC that comes out there and can exchange information between that industry, whether it's nuclear power, whether it's chemical, whether it's wastewater, whatever it is, there has to be someone doing some type of analysis function. So some type of intelligence. And then it establishes an independent center, one for physical effects and one for cyber effects, which is nice, but doesn't quite get us where we want to be in terms of how that goes together. Now, under the latest administration, and this was one that kind of caught me by surprise, and I'm not sure how many other people in the area, people who are probably tuned in were right on top of this, but DHS created a new agency, a cybersecurity infrastructure agency as part of their core structure. So like a FEMA or like an ICE, they split it out under DHS to just look at infrastructure. But even though they just look at infrastructure, the main part of their title is cybersecurity. So that seems to already take them less to physical effects and more towards the cybersecurity side of the equation, not that kind of holistic approach of how do we make things work. Their main goal, their main task, the first line of their mission is that they're supposed to be out there doing federal network protection. All those government industries that have to talk to each other, these are the guys that are supposed to protect it. And they did that through integrating 2 of those cybersecurity agencies, 2 of those previous ones that were separate and work separate, the US Computer Emergency Response Team and the ICS, or the SCADA, the Domain Administration Systems, right? The critical infrastructure systems for that ICS. However, as important as the function as we think critical infrastructure is, this agency, as of 2020, only receives about 0.5% of DHS's overall budget. So in order to go out and do these things to protect the infrastructure, they get hardly anything. So if they get hardly anything, how do they compare? Or what do they actually protect? Now, we've been talking about sectors, and we've been talking about how they go through. And I kind of aggregated them while I was writing, because again, there's a lot of sectors and there's a lot of information. There's a lot of detail that you can follow up in various ways. So the CI group over on the left of that chart is my aggregation. The ones on the right are the actual sectors as they're defined by CISA, as they're defined by DHS that are out there. So I kind of roughly group them into sections. It would maybe make more sense if they went together, but again, that's just my interpretation. So we see these aggregated groups because they thought they made the most sense at the time. They thought they made the most sense when they put them together. But when we talk about space and we kind of return that focus, we see that a lot of these groups kind of cross-cut space services. They hit us in a couple different areas. They hit space in a couple different areas. In order to maintain a space capability, there may be functions that you have to use across many of the sections. We see a defense industrial base with construction, with building new material, with operating launch pads, in moving functions. We see power is probably secondary to workers, but again, fuel, the chemical, the fuel and the transport. A lot of space fuel is highly toxic, and we have to move that around. And as we get more and more into space, we see transportation. We heard during the keynote this morning, talking about the potential to land on Mars, space tourism, and those type of functions. And if those are there, those will have to be protected no less than we protect the FAA or the airline industry, which as of now comes under those transportation systems. But again, separate and probably a very different construct than we think about when we think about protecting space. So as I mentioned, I had 3 hypotheses because every good research, every good study, or every good thought in critical thinking starts with a couple of hypotheses and move through. The first being, if space industry infrastructure is protected, then significant value will be preserved for the general public safety, health, and economic outcomes of US citizens. If space, then 2, if it's protected, then significant value to the national security of the US, right? So we kind of have the commercial side and the federal side kind of split. As we see in SpaceX, as we see in NASA, different areas have different missions. And we even see between NASA as a federal and the Space Force as a federal, where they have a little bit different aspect, a little different role into what kind of protections they have and what they do. But they all contribute to our national security and to making the lives of American citizens better. And then the final one, I tried to evaluate whether any of the industries significantly covered it, whether space had a lower score at the end of the day. So that when we match those scores up, I could honestly say, I think something else covers space well enough that I don't need to make the changes or move forward. So in terms of public safety, what did I look at and evaluate? Well, I took the public health statement off the CDC, right? The science of protecting and improving the health of people in their communities, promote healthy lifestyles, research disease, detect, prevent, and respond to infectious disease. So maybe not really as much about space, but maybe a little bit when we talk about GPS or when we talk about how we move emergency services back and forth, or how we do contact tracing with items like pandemics, and that we use those functions to get together in a certain way. For economic benefit, the Department of Commerce tracks 22 different sectors to the Bureau of Economic Analysis that could potentially play into space. And that comes from the North American Industry Council study, where they break it all out and have different numbers for all the functions. In terms of national security, it's always good to use a military definition. So I went back and used the Space Force definition, and the Space Force definition of space power from their doctrine, their manual 1-1 or -1. It's the totality of a nation's ability to exploit the space domain in pursuit of prosperity and security, comparatively assessed as the relative strength of a state's ability to leverage the space domain. So here, as we talk relative capability, we talk back to qualitative, and another one that led me back to the qualitative. But we also talk about the daily contributions. As a former intelligence guy, space contributes a lot to our daily awareness, our daily situational awareness of what's going on, both in terms of communication, in terms of monitoring, in terms of signals, in terms of imaging. There's a lot out there that we can do with space that makes us more protected as a nation. And then for a counter hypothesis, again, we counter the scores. So if we're going to do all that, if we're going to make that evaluation, we've got to bring it back and say, well, what do I consider to be space infrastructure? If I had to be king for the day and I had to set this fence around things that were related to space, what would they be? And this is, again, back to that North American industry classification system. This is a Department of Commerce. This is a way to split things out and look at functions. Now, they start with 2 digits if you haven't looked at it before. They go all the way down to 6 digits to classify things. So as they go down through each subsequent level, they break it out, and they break it out further and further and further until you get down to the actual system you want. But at that top level, there's about 6 or 7 different areas which would cover space, which space could conceivably fall in as infrastructure, where we could bring those out and specifically identify industries that are associated with space. We see manufacturing. We see the wholesale trade as we move things back and forth. Obviously, transportation, as we talk about tourism, we talk about moving stuff back to orbit. So not only personal transportation, but Commercial transportation. How much does it cost to transport satellites into orbit? How much does it cost to monitor those satellites, to run those satellites if they're for a commercial agency and not for a government agency? Professional services on public administration. What we see is missing from space during the last NAICS classification, when the FAA, who is responsible for space, went out and said, hey, these are the areas that apply to space, they left out information. They left out any kind of cyber or information control or orbital control or back and forth communications through it. They left out construction associated with space. As we do more spaceports, obviously they don't see they change a lot, or they don't see they move enough that construction will be a factor, or even consider space construction if we're doing on-orbit construction, or even construction away from the Earth at some future date, whether we're doing cislunar construction. And then accommodation and food services, which covers space tourism and hotels and all those functions. If we look at kind of the global values, what we see, if we break those areas, we say, hey, we have to worry about launch, we have to worry about ground control, we have to worry about government space, orbital functions, and manufacturing. And if we see these as kind of the 6 rough areas where we could categorize space and say these areas need to be protected, we see the global investment numbers there respectively. Launch, about $5.5 billion a year. Ground control, about $73 billion. Government space for the entire world, about $82 billion. Orbital functions, about $160 billion goes into orbital functions every year. Now, this is kind of a misnomer, and as you dig into it, some of those numbers may be off, because some of that accounts for satellite television as much as it does for weather or services or communications, but still that's where a lot of that money is. And then manufacturing was an unknown. The FAA didn't currently classify it when they pulled those numbers, when they pulled those global numbers to see where manufacturing stacked out. So the meat of the argument, right, is I went back and forth. You can see zeros and ones along that top line for space where I said yes or no. And in all fairness, I said, hey, space doesn't actually contribute to public health. If space makes a significant impact to public health, I wouldn't see that. But public safety, absolutely. When we talk about GPS and emergency signals, economic benefit, yes, absolutely. And national security, yes, absolutely, right? Those are those H1 and H2. But what I did, if you remember, when I aggregated the 16 sectors earlier into 5, so I did evaluate each sector, but for the sake of your reading ease and your eyes on this screen, I just aggregated them. So what you see there is the average of those sectors across. So you see that in those scores, several of them do better than space. Life-sustaining and digital spaces have better contributions to public health than space. However, in public safety, what you see is digital spaces and hazardous both match up to space. But when you hit economic benefit, you talk about the sheer economic benefit you get from those sectors. The only one I think matches up to space is, again, those digital spaces. That cyber and information space is the same as space, or should be as protected as well as space. So that leads up to your averages. And your highest average was your digital spaces, which came in at a 0.9 as an average of those scores. But space came in at a 0.7. So of those 6 sectors, including space, you see space coming in as the second one, which definitely means from the first hypothesis, you would see that it proved true because it's only behind 1 sector. So we should probably defend it, or at least look at defending it as we move forward. In national security, because they were aggregated, several of them had sections which didn't directly contribute, I felt, to national security on that binary scale. So I felt space came in as the highest on this scale. And then if you aggregate those 2 scores, if you just added H1 to H2, and it's not the best statistical reference, but it was a statistical reference, the aggregate rank you come up with is that space would be the first out of those aggregated sectors with the most importance to those 4 areas that we mentioned along the way, and that we should think about protecting it as an area. So qualitatively, based on that assessment, I think space definitely merits inclusion as a CI sector. Being a government function, it probably has to be further evaluated. There probably needs to be a study or a panel to look at some of the numbers, to do some of the quantitative measurements for the economy, to do some quantitative measurements or establish some metrics for health and well-being in those types of functions as we move forward, to really come up with a solid score before we can invest more money in it as a CISA sector. As I said, based on the economic value, maybe the digital contributions or private industry gains, because SpaceX, as we all know, as well as other companies, have made significant gains over the past couple of years to moving forward. And also in looking at this study, I found there's not really any way to evaluate CI. There's not any regular look at what's being done or what's moving or how things are changing. And as fast as things are changing in our world, it seems like there should be a regular commission on some type of 3 to 5 year basis to evaluate the merits of CI, whether it's a budgeting function or something else, and match up to how we need to put it together for the future. What comes next? What do we look at next? And where do we move? And space could definitely fall into this, but even if we don't get to space and we say it's covered, those other sections definitely need to be looked at in more detail along a more regular period of time. So I think we're moving questions to the end. And I think I'm right at about 20 minutes, so I think I moved it on pretty good. I apologize if I talk too fast, but thanks for the opportunity. Dr. Chapman.
Thank you, Mark.
Turn it back over to you.
Okay. All right, let me get into slideshow mode. Okay, what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about how some of the literature and the communication that U.S. Space Force and other U.S. government agencies are preparing on Space Force. So this is the Space Force logo. Many people are drawn to visual impressions, and so this is the graphic identity Space Force has chosen for itself. Space Force has been around a couple of years. It was officially established in just about a year ago in the 2020 Defense Authorization Act, which President Trump signed in December of last year. And I wanted to introduce you to some of this literature that covers various areas about Space Force, economics, military, and political aspects, and how it may affect U.S. national security for the foreseeable future. There's been a lot of publicly accessible government and military information resources on military uses of space for a number of decades. And one producer of a lot of this information is Air University, which is the Air Force's professional military educational institution located at Maxwell Air Force Base near Montgomery, Alabama. One venue this organization's publishing arm, Air University Press, has produced is Air and Space Power Journal. It comes out quarterly. It's an open access journal, and all these resources I'm showing you are open access, so you don't have to be tied to a academic or research library or a particular laboratory. So this was a article that came out about a year ago called Space Power and the Foundations of an Independent Space Force, and they'll have all sorts of different analysis and speculation about what a space force will mean. This was an article a few years ago that was published in November, December 2014, and this article focused particularly on the search for a warfighting doctrine for Space Force. It began by stressing the role military doctrine development had played from historical figures such as Clausewitz, Mahan, and Duhay, and it asked, where is the space Mahan? And so presented some different findings or theories here. In the fall of 2019, there was another article in Air and Space Force Journal called A Plan for U.S. Space Force, the what, why, how, and when. And so they mentioned a quote President Trump made at the National Space Council, we're going to have the Air Force and we're going to have the Space Force separate but equal. Then there are a lot of policy documents put out by DOD and various other agencies describing what they want different agencies or missions or organizations within their department to accomplish. And these documents are numbered. So this is a directive, and it was released in June of 2017, and it mentions earlier directives or policy documents that it updated or supersedes. And so this is just a sample of it. It's talking about the DoD space enterprise and all defense-related segments of national security space. And so there are different resources in here. They mentioned the then leadership role of the Secretary of the Air Force in this objective. And then Space Force was officially established by President Trump in Space Policy Directive 4, issued on February 19th of last year. And so it's, as you know, executive orders are documents issued by presidents and their administrations. They have the force of law, though they don't have to go through Congress. These documents are published on the White House website, and then their official publication occurs when they're published in the Federal Register. So this tells who this document was directed to. And you'll notice there are a wide variety of agencies extending just beyond DOD. And there's some different objectives in here. They mention right at the top of this particular page what the Space Force's objective is, and a couple things including ensuring unfair use of space for U.S. national security purposes, the U.S. economy, and the American public and allies, and various other provisions, including projecting military power in support of national interests, developing a community of professionals focusing on space's national security aspects. Then just last month, Space Policy Directive 5 came out, and this involves cybersecurity principles for space systems. So again, this again reemphasizes the importance of unfettered freedom to operate in space to U.S. economic security, national security, and scientific knowledge, and what space systems enable, what they enable to achieve those objectives. Then many military branches are now including space as part of their strategic interest and objectives. This was a July document from the Air Forces, their Arctic strategy. And it mentions that it identifies the Arctic as a region of strategic opportunity for air and space forces, and then explains various other objectives that they will, the Air Force will try to carry out. And then U.S. Space Force, USSF, is starting to develop its own literature describing its missions. In June, they came out with this capstone publication called Doctrine for Space Forces. And so this is their first stab at trying to develop a doctrinal corpus for military space power. So they're talking about the Space Force's three cornerstone responsibilities: preserving freedom of space, enabling joint lethality and effectiveness, and providing independent options. The emphasis on lethality has been an important emphasis of Trump administration national security policy documents. And so they'll explain various other objectives they want U.S. military space doctrine to encompass, including orbital warfare, space electromagnetic warfare, and space battle management, and some other things, including military intelligence and cyber operations. And then there's some additional literature in here. And so they're mentioning that military space activities are currently confined to the geocentric regime, but there's commercial investments in new technology give the potential for such interest to expand to the cislunar regime. And then this doctrinal publication mentions and provides different details on various space power disciplines, such as orbital warfare, space battle management, and it provides further elaboration on how they define these items. In June of this summer, DoD released an unclassified space strategy summary document, and so they emphasize some key points emphasize are maintaining space superiority, and then the wide variety of aspects DoD must be prepared to engage in to defend U.S. Space interests, providing space support to national joint and combined operation, and ensuring space stability. And you can look at these at your leisure. And so they mention that the current defense space enterprise is not built for the current strategic environment. And then it references threats, challenges, and opportunities, particularly Chinese and Russian efforts to be the most egregious threats to U.S. space interests. But they also mention North Korea and Iran, and potentially other entities may threaten U.S. space interests. Then every year, Congress has to fund USSF, and as well as other entities, and this is done through a National Defense Authorization Act. So this is a section came out in July of this year from the House of Representatives report on the National Defense Authorization Act. During this report, Space Force was mentioned 35 times. So they give you funding information and budget request information for Space Force's operation and maintenance and development, test, and evaluation. And then this gives you a much greater dive into a specific program funding request. So how much was requested for things such as space control technology, how much the committee recommended. In some cases, the committee recommended more than DOD. In some cases, they recommended less. And then congressional committee legislative reports also give the committees and their members the opportunity to make comments on current trends and developments within Space Force. They can say if there are things they're pleased with. They also mention their concerns they have. So for instance, they talk about the concern that Air Force doesn't have a Senate confirmed civilian leader dealing with acquisition, budget, and long-term planning matters. And then this is a section of the Senate draft report. It had not signed a report number as of this. And so they have different materials in here. And so they're talking about things such as tactically responsive space launch operations. And again, this goes into exhaustive detail, but it's important to recognize what congressional appropriators and overseers are considering as important program and managerial topics for Space Force to look at and to make the American public aware of how our tax dollars are not being used effectively. Another important area with information about Space Force is government contracting. There's a website called sam.gov, which is the way you can find out how government agencies are maybe issuing contracts or actually issuing contracts, so you can participate in potential procurement opportunities. And so this is a description of a program about potential value the Space Force can offer. And this is an contact information on this particular grant. And these are individuals at Andrews Joint Base in Maryland, and they'll give you their names and their emails and phone numbers. So if you want your business to get involved in potentially involved in this contract, this is whom you can contact. And also mention that space contracts for Space Force and facilities for Space Force are located in different areas around the country. And so, eventually as Space Force becomes more mature, you can see if it's impacting your community, your congressional district, your state. There's a number of different public opinion polls on Space Force, and this will increase in the recent years. These are a couple polls that were released by the Pew Center and CNN. A May-June 2019 CNN poll with 1,284 national adult veterans was asked if they approved or opposed creation of a new military space force. So you can see there's a mixed response, slightly more disapproved. It'll be interesting as time goes by to see how that is reflected in public opinion. And then in August of 2018, CNN asked the poll of a number of different individuals on whether they favored creating a new Space Force branch. 37% said yes, 55% no, and 8% didn't have an opinion. So you can see there's been in the ensuing year, there's been a slight tick upward in support for Space Force. And with all the different public policy issues we're confronting, it's probably not highly visible on the radar of many people, but it is something to keep track of. Now, there are a lot of different government agencies that are going to put out publicly available information on Space Force, and particularly evaluating its funding and performance. These will include congressional committee hearings, and this will be especially true for the House and Senate Armed Services Committee. Both of these committees have subcommittees that deal with strategic forces, and I believe right now those are currently the ones that are conducting oversight of a Space Force. There will also be the defense subcommittees of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees. These are the committees that actually have the authority to cut the checks for Space Force programs. And so they have a lot of freely available information on their websites or on websites through the U.S. Government Publishing Office. Another good resource I recommend are Congressional Research Service reports. This is the Library of Congress's in-house think tank. Their reports have been freely available to the American public since 2018. Some of these reports are updated regularly, and you'll be able to find lots of different materials on there on Space Force and any other government policy area you're interested in, so such as the space industry. These will contain references to maybe currently existing laws or regulations, potentially court cases, legislation Congress is considering during the current congressional session. Then there's the Government Accountability Office. This is another congressional support agency that does reports on the management performance of government programs at the request of Congress. GAO officials will testify before congressional committees as needed. These reports will be very candid, and they'll contain detailed information on the performance of these programs. There'll be lots of graphs and charts. Toward the end of the reports, the GAO will list recommendations for improving these programs, and the agency or agencies whose programs are being reviewed get the chance to comment on what GAO says. Many times they'll agree with what GAO says, but sometimes they'll disagree with what GAO says. And so GAO reports are another resource you can look at. Then there are Congressional Budget Office, or CBO reports. The CBO prepares reports on the overall federal budget for Congress. They're objective reports. They can include cost estimates on legislation that's reported out of congressional committees. They also do reports on the budgetary implications of government programs. And just last month, they came out with a report on potential budget cost of creating a space National Guard. And so this included a couple different budgetary scenarios depending on the personnel size of the Space Force. Department of Defense Inspector General reports are also good resources to look at. They do reports on the management performance of DoD programs. They also, these Inspector General offices also have the legal authority to issue criminal penalties if fraud's committed in these programs by agency employees or private sector contractors. Then there's also the Department of Defense Office of Testing and Evaluation. They do reports on various technical aspects of DoD programs. It's usually toward the end of the calendar year that they come out with their current year reports. And so, for instance, in their 2019 report, they had studies on the GPS program, on the Space Fence program. These will give you information about who the contractors are for the program, strengths and weaknesses for the program. And then regulatory policy is another important area. Proposed and newly approved federal regulations are published in the Federal Register. Interested individuals and organizations can comment on these regulations through the website regulations.gov as part of the Administrative Procedure Act. And this can give you lots of different ideas of how informed and motivated public opinion feels about federal regulatory issues, including those pertaining to a Space Force. And so I'd like to share in closing, I'd like to share a quote with you from James Madison. He wrote it in a letter to a friend about 5 years after he left the presidency, and he mentions, knowledge will forever govern ignorance. And a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. And so we're fortunate that in a democratic society, we have the ability to try to influence governmental policy concerning Space Force, whether we wish to participate in government contracting, comment on government regulations, participate in public debate, and discussion of these issues, and contact our congressional representatives and senators to let them know what they think of these matters. And with that, I will turn things over to Ivàn.